Hello there and good evening. Thank you so much for being with us. We are coming on the air tonight with breaking news. Donald Trump says he expects to be arrested after a letter says he is a target of a January 6 probe. Thank you so much for being with us here on the program tonight. We really appreciate it. We have a lot to get to tonight on the program with some extensive analysis and commentary on the day's news as it relates to former President Trump and January 6th with this new probe and this new target letter that the former president says he received. Coming up on the program, Brian Karem, White House columnist, as well as Dave Levinthal of Raw Story magazine. They are standing by, and they will both join me to discuss what we can make of this situation. But before that, I had a chance to speak with Democratic presidential candidate Marianne Williamson earlier today for an extensive one-on-one conversation. We talked about a wide range of issues, but I started by asking her about this breaking news in connection to former President Donald Trump. Democratic presidential candidate Marianne Williamson is with me now. Thank you so much for taking the time. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me on.
So I guess I just kind of the obvious start here before we get into your campaign is some of the breaking news that everyone is following right now as it relates to this target letter that was sent to former President Trump in relation to his role on January 6th. He is obviously seen as the front runner right now on the GOP field. If you do something that would be very historic, defeat President Joe Biden on the Democratic side and run against Donald Trump for the Republican nomination, what would be your overall message to him?
Well, Donald Trump represents a view of the United States which is very different than mine. Among other things, he pits people against each other. To me, the power of the United States is that out of many, we are one. So a lot of it has to do with the tenor of the presidency. I want to make people remember that none of us have ownership of this country. All of us have ownership of this country, and that no one has a monopoly on the truth. You know, President Eisenhower said that the American mind at its best is both liberal and conservative. But Trump tends to have a my way or the highway type of view of America, and he tends to project onto anyone who doesn't agree with him that we are an enemy of the people. And this is very dangerous. I think he has stimulated some of the worst aspects of the American consciousness. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that, according to his allies, it was reported just yesterday that their plans for a second term, should he have a second term, has to do with the president taking over agencies and aspects of the U.S. government that currently the executive does not have the power to do. So I think that his politics is somewhat dangerous for this country. And I will present to the American people a very different kind of view, a country that belongs to all of our people, and particularly specific agenda items. I want universal health care that the former president, as well as the current president, do not stand for. I want tuition-free college at public colleges and universities, which neither of them stand for. I want free health care, free child care. I want paid family leave. I want a guaranteed living wage, and I want guaranteed housing. That's why I have a 21st century economic bill of rights. Whether it's my opposition to President Biden during the primary or my opposition to President Trump during the general. I represent a fundamental difference, and that is that I represent an economic new beginning, an economic U-turn that returns the major resources of this country back to the people to whom it rightfully belongs.
And so I guess picking up on that, a lot of Republicans and Democrats who are talking about the campaign, specifically people on the Democratic side of things, they are saying that by, multiple Democrats running for the nomination, it could make things, divisive, it could make things polarizing, and therefore increase the chances of the GOP being successful. Would you find any truth to any of those arguments?
No, that's their PR narrative. In 2016, there were a lot of Republicans running, and the Republican won. In 2020, there were a lot of Democrats running, and the Democrat won. So this is just a narrative concocted by the Biden administration and the DNC. That's all that is.
And so how do you overcome the odds? I mean, this hasn't been done in modern history where a incumbent president was primaried by someone that was then successful, that then went on to win the general election. But this time is different because not only are you primarying him, but he also has Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who has a ridiculous amount of name recognition, given that he was a part of the Kennedy family for a long time. How do you overcome those odds?
And he's still a part of the Kennedy family, by the way. Of course, we don't
Sorry,
want to take
yes.
away from him. What happened before has very little bearing on what is happening now. Donald Trump was considered a long shot. Oh, it'll never happen in 2016. We're living at a time, not just in American politics, but I think in the world in which anything could happen. I think the American people are awakening on both left and right to the realization that political parties and their dominant themes should not dominate our politics. It should be whatever the people want. And I think that the American people also realize that the same old is not delivering on the promises of democracy for us. There's no appetite, or very little appetite in my country, for another Trump-Biden rematch. 2/3 of the American people have said that they would like to see someone other than the President Biden run again. So actually, Robert Kennedy and myself are actually speaking into an appetite among the American electorate to hear some options and not just the one that the DNC would sort of stick down our throat.
And many people right now, I think, would agree with the statement that the Democratic Party is a fairly big tent party. You have those people who, don't necessarily support the things that you were talking about, like universal health care, free child care, things like that. How do you help Democrats to adapt to some of those ideas, given that, again, the current president, who is seen as the leader of the Democratic Party in many respects, doesn't support it?
It's not a matter of convincing the people. The people are already convinced. The majority of Americans, both Democrat and Republican, already support universal health care. The majority of Americans, both Democrat and Republican, already support tuition-free college. The problem is not with the American people. The problem is with a political system that is so in the grip of corporate power in the United States that legislators do tend to serve the profit-making goals of their corporate donors than the expressed will of the American people. So the problem isn't the American people. They're already with me on this. The problem is a very sclerotic political system that does as much to suppress as to facilitate the expression of the will of the people.
I do want to ask you too, we're almost out of time here, but in terms of the Republicans and even some Democrats, to be frank with you, a lot of people are coming out and saying that President Biden shouldn't run again due to the age factor, the fact that he is the oldest president in American history. Does that concern you in any way? Do you see that as a factor that should bar someone from running again?
Well, there's a very simple way for the president to prove his mental agility, to prove that he's up to the job, to prove that he could take on Donald Trump in a debate, and that is to debate Robert Kennedy and myself. Real simple. We can handle this. We can see for ourselves whether or not the president would be up for this. Have him debate us, and I hope that he will.
And just before we conclude, last question here. If you do get that debate that you and RFK Jr. both are hoping for, what would you want to say to President Biden? You ran against him in 2020. Your messaging this time around is very much the same as it was in 2020. So what would be your overall message to the president?
A debate isn't about a message to the president. A debate is about a message to the American people. And what I would want to say to the American people is that their rage is legitimate, their frustration is legitimate, that our economy is rigged against 99% or at least 80% of the American people, and that it is time for an economic new beginning. And I look forward to a debate to have the opportunity to tell people what it would mean, how we would do this. How would we have an economic U-turn? How would we make a just transition from a dirty economy to a clean economy? How we would make a just transition from a war economy to a peace economy, and hopefully inspire people to know that we can do this. We just have to elect the right president.
Okay, we will leave it there. 2024 Democratic presidential candidate Marianne Williamson, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, that was Marianne Williamson. She is, of course, a candidate for the Democratic nomination in 2024, running against President Joe Biden. She hopes to do something historic that no one else has done in modern history. She hopes to primary an incumbent president, be victorious in the primary, and then move on to the general election and defeat whoever the GOP nominee is, which, as of right now, is looking like it will most likely be former President Trump, as all the polls suggest he is the current frontrunner. Let's get some reaction on this now with Brian Karem, White House columnist. Brian, thanks so much for joining me.
Always a pleasure, Wyatt. Good to see you.
Yeah, you too. I suppose anytime there's something like whether it's the first two indictments that happened, whether it's now with this legal news, it seems as if the supporters of Donald Trump just become more enthusiastic. They seem, anytime something like this happens, his fundraising goes up, his poll numbers go up. Why do you think that is?
Because I think that's not true. I think that's what he wants you to think. I think the polls are I want to say self-deprecating humor, but really it's just a self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, you poll the same people, you get the same results. His money is consistent because he does have a core of followers. 20 to 30% of the people in this country believe him no matter what he does. So they're going to continue to support him because, it's easier to fool people than it is to convince them they've been fooled, and he fools them quite often. I think I'm really, with this latest round of bad news for Donald, think you will find more people abandoning him, especially the donor class. And I don't think he's going to have much of a chance of actually getting the nomination, much less being the president next time around, for what it's worth.
Well, and to pick up on that, I mean, a lot of his staffers that were with him over the course of his time at the White House, I mean, people like Mick Mulvaney, Alyssa Farah Griffin, there's like too many people to count, frankly, that have, since distanced themselves from the former president. But even the candidates who are still in the GOP field right now, like Ron DeSantis, like Nikki Haley, they have come out a bit more than they first did when they announced their intentions to run, but they still seem hesitant to, call him out like you would traditionally see in a primary. Why is that?
Money and support. They all are courting the same money that he's courting. And to win in the Republican Party, you can't go left, you can only go right. So it's one lane only. And if you can knock Trump out of that lane, fine. But otherwise, you're stuck in that lane with him. So you can't really ride him too hard.
And the argument that all of this is that we're talking about today, in particular, is of course with classified documents and everything. The argument that Trump is making repeatedly over and over again is essentially he did it or she did it, so I'm okay to do it. Also, a lot of people pointed out that the obvious difference here is that people like Mike Pence, like Hillary Clinton, they cooperated with the authorities. They turned it over when they were asked to. Do you think this situation would have been much different? I mean, kind of an obvious question, if he had have cooperated when asked to turn the documents back over?
All he had to do was go, hold on, you're right, fellas. I may have taken some stuff by mistake. Let me get it all to you. And he didn't do that. So then he said that it was a put up job by the FBI, that it was a false flag, that they had planted the stuff. Then he changed that and said, no. And by the way, I can keep it because it's mine, because I declassified it in my head, which of course he, doesn't really count. That maybe an empty, wide open range for things to take place in the inside of his head, but that doesn't count for the rest of the world. So now he's just saying it's mine, it's all mine, and I get to keep it. And I'm sorry, that's not the way it works. He's caused this mess himself with, now this is just the Mar-a-Lago document case, but the case that's coming up is much more serious, and it's a January 6th, which could include sedition charges or even more obstruction of justice, seditious obstruction, and some things that could keep him from running for president a second time or a third time.
Yeah, so I guess to pick up on that point of things, the news that broke today is in relation to January 6th. And I mean, a lot of people specifically, that is when they distanced themselves from Trump, was after January 6th, again, like those people that I mentioned. But why do you think it is? Because Donald Trump hasn't really changed much on policy, more so just personality and becoming more like the way he is. So why are all of these people distancing themselves from him after January 6th and not beforehand?
Well, because after January 6th, they realized if they don't distance themselves from Trump, they too could end up wearing orange. This is all about being afraid to go to prison. And that's why they've distanced themselves from him, because they see the handwriting on the wall, and they don't want to go with Donald Trump into the land of, segregated housing units.
All right, we'll leave it there. Brian, Karem, thanks so much as always.
Yeah, always a pleasure.
All right, let's go next now to the editor-in-chief at Raw Story magazine tonight. I started out by asking him about some of the latest breaking news in connection to former President Trump and the impact that it could have on the 2024 campaign. Dave Levinthal is with me now. Thank you so much for making the time.
Hey, my pleasure to be with you.
So I guess I just want to start out with obviously all of this stuff that is happening with Donald Trump, not just what we are seeing today, but we've seen a lot of stuff. He's been indicted on multiple different occasions for multiple different reasons. Oftentimes, though, people talk about it in a negative context, but there's kind of the old saying that any publicity is good publicity, and certainly it would seem like for Donald Trump that would be the case. I mean, his fundraising numbers seem to rise after any sort of legal issues like this one. Why do you think that is?
His fundraising numbers and his poll numbers. Let's seize on that for a second and talk about the short-term implications. Anytime Donald Trump is in any sort of peril, he uses it as an opportunity to telegraph to his supporters, I need your help. And I need your help financially. I need your help verbally. I need your help in any way you are willing to give it. So I think we can fully expect, as it appears that Jack Smith, the special counsel who's investigating Donald Trump, is going to move forward with additional charges at the federal level. Once that happens, Donald Trump is likely going to play the same playbook that he had played with his indictment and charges in New York City and then at the federal level not many weeks ago.
And certainly, I mean, with the 2024 campaign at this point in time, I mean, a lot of people are looking at it. They're looking at what it could mean. But there's a lot of other candidates in the campaign at this point in time who really, not on very many occasions at least, have came out and said anything too harshly against former President Trump. In a usual primary, you would have constant jabs back and forth, whereas right now there, might be the occasional arguments made between candidates. But I mean, many people presume that's because they know that they need to take supporters away from the Trump campaign, but perhaps touch on that a bit more.
And that's the other side of the coin, is the long game here. Donald Trump, he may be benefiting in certain ways, financially or otherwise, from this legal peril that he's in. But we've got a lot coming up over the next 7 months. We have candidate debates, and you mentioned that there are other Republican candidates running for the presidency. Well, there's more than a dozen, at least semi-legitimate candidates who would love to take a chunk out of Donald Trump as much as possible. They haven't been willing to do so, many of them in really overt fashion, but they're going to get to a point where they have to. And I think we're going to start to see that perhaps as soon as next month. And not only just Chris Christie and a couple of other candidates who have been very vocal anti-Trumpers through this campaign, but perhaps some of the ones at the top of the heap right now. That's Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. That's Senator Tim Scott, former UN ambassador, and South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley, among others. And even Mike Pence, who right now is kind of nowhere in the polls, had a terrible fundraising quarter for the second quarter. If he's going to have a shot here, he's going to have to probably go at the king, his former boss, his former running mate, Donald Trump. So the intrigue here, I think, will grow as we get closer and closer to the real game afoot, which is the presidential caucuses and primaries, which begin in January and will hit the states of New Hampshire, Iowa, South Carolina, and Nevada over what's roughly a 50-day period in January and February.
And just before we conclude here, there was the event recently that was described as a presidential forum that was moderated by Tucker Carlson, the former Fox News host. A lot of people were taking note that Donald Trump did not appear at that event and signaling that as a reason potentially why he wouldn't come to the first debate in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Certainly, he has said publicly that he doesn't see a lot of benefit in going to a debate like that. Do you think, frankly, the other candidates would be able to benefit as much if Donald Trump wasn't there, given that, a lot of people would probably, in many cases, tune in to see the front runner in the race?
Well, Donald Trump is right. He doesn't have a whole lot to gain from it. He's leading in the polls. He has more support than any other candidate. Definitely has a plurality of support among the candidates who are running for the presidency on the Republican side. So if he goes into a debate situation, they can take shots at him. If he's in an environment where he's being interviewed in sort of a uncontrolled setting or with a interviewer who is not necessarily all that friendly to him, that he doesn't gain much from that either. So right now he is basically fine with the status quo and moving forward as he does. Will that change? Will that have to change for Donald Trump? Quite possibly, particularly if his poll numbers begin to go down. And I wouldn't be shocked if that happens. Remember that primaries, polls go up, polls go down. Polls are a snapshot in time. They move and are like the wind. Sometimes they're blowing this way and sometimes they're blowing that. And I think you're going to see that as, again, we get closer to the primary season, that Donald Trump entirely could drop in the polls and will likely have to change his tactics as a result of that reality coming to bear.
Okay, we will leave it there. That's Dave Levinthal, editor-in-chief of Rossroy. Thanks so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Hey, thanks, Wyatt.
All right, that is going to do it for the program tonight. Be sure to tune in tomorrow at 10 o'clock Eastern, where another presidential candidate will be joining me. Tune in for a one-on-one interview with Cornel West. That's tomorrow at 10 Eastern on The Wyatt Sharp Show.